In the winter of 2015, a couple from California took the trip they had been putting off for years. A cruise up the Nile. Temples in the morning, dinner on the boat at night. On one of those nights, the husband felt something wrong in his stomach. Not sharp, just wrong. By morning he was doubled over. By that afternoon he was in a clinic in Luxor, and within days he was strapped to a stretcher inside an air ambulance, flying out of Egypt with a mass growing on his pancreas. Inside that mass was a single kind of bacterium. Over the next 4 months, doctors on 2 continents would put every antibiotic they had into his body, one after another, and watch all of them fail. His name was Thomas Patterson. He was 68 years old, and he was a professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego. That is the detail worth holding on to for the next 15 minutes. Of all the people in the world this could have happened to, it happened to a man married to an infectious disease epidemiologist at a major American research hospital, with a specialist in resistant infection down the hall. It still took 4 months. And for most of that time, everyone involved was doing exactly what the standard of care told them to do. The plane landed in Frankfurt. German doctors drained the mass and found what it was: a pancreatic pseudocyst, a pocket of fluid that forms when a pancreas is injured, in his case by gallstones. It happens to a lot of people. Most of the time it drains or it resolves and the story ends there. They sent the fluid to the laboratory. The culture came back with a name: Acinetobacter baumannii. It is not exotic. It lives in soil and water, it lives on hospital surfaces, and it is very good at living on hospital surfaces. It survives drying, it survives disinfectant, it survives on a bed rail for weeks. American military doctors gave it a nickname during the Iraq War, when it kept turning up in wounded soldiers flown home. They called it Iraqibacter. For most people it is nothing at all. For a man with a cyst on his pancreas and a tube running into his abdomen, it is an opportunity. Then the laboratory ran the second test, the one where they take the organism and expose it, one by one, to the drugs available to treat it. The report came back a column of the same letter: resistant to cephalosporins, resistant to meropenem, resistant to gentamicin, to amikacin, to trimethoprim-sulfamethoxazole, to tetracycline, to ciprofloxacin. There was one thing left on the list, and it was not a modern drug. Colistin was developed in the 1940s and largely abandoned in the 70s, because it damages the kidneys badly enough that doctors decided the trade was not worth making. It came back into use for one reason: for certain bacteria there was nothing else. So they gave him colistin and it worked. For a while. They flew him home to San Diego, and the record from that hospital reads as a slow, orderly loss of ground. By the 36th day, colistin alone was not holding it, and a second drug was added alongside it. By the 51st day he was in respiratory failure. They put a tube down his throat and moved him to intensive care. Then a drain slipped. The contents of the cyst, which is to say several liters of fluid packed with a bacterium nothing could kill, emptied into his abdominal cavity. He went into septic shock. His blood pressure collapsed and stayed collapsed. And somewhere in there, the organism did the thing that organisms do when you keep a drug in front of them long enough. The laboratory retested it. This time the last column changed too. The Acinetobacter growing inside Thomas Patterson was now resistant to colistin. At that point there was no antibiotic on the planet, approved or experimental, with reliable activity against the specific organism in this specific man. By the 108th day he was unresponsive. His kidneys were failing. His body had been fighting an infection it could not clear for nearly 4 months, and the medical team had reached the end of the list. And this is the part of the story that is hard to sit with. Because the treatment that would work was not new, and it was not undiscovered. It had been published in 1917. It had been used on patients for decades. And the reason nobody in that hospital had reached for it was that the Western world had decided, on purpose, to stop. Stephanie Strathy had a laptop, a chair beside a hospital bed, and a husband the team had run out of drugs for. So she did the one thing her training had ever equipped her to do. She started reading. What she found was not a new idea. It was an old one with a 70-year hole in the middle of it. Because wherever bacteria exist, something eats them. In 1915, an English bacteriologist named Frederick Twort noticed that his bacterial cultures were developing clear patches, places where the bacteria had simply dissolved. He published it in The Lancet that year and called it a bacteriolytic agent. 2 years later, working at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, a microbiologist named Félix de Herelle described the same thing and went further. He said the clear patches were being made by something alive, something that hunted bacteria, and he gave it a name: Bacteriophage, literally eater of bacteria. D'Herelle spent the rest of his career treating people with them. And in Paris, sometime around 1920, he met a Georgian bacteriologist named George Elieva, who saw what this could be worth to a country with more infection than medicine. Elieva went home and founded an institute in Tbilisi in 1923 built around it, and invited de Herelle to come and work there. That institute still exists today. In the Soviet Union, phage therapy was ordinary medicine. You could buy preparations at a pharmacy. In the West it lost. Not because it was disproven. Because in 1928 Alexander Fleming noticed a mold, and by the 1940s penicillin existed, and penicillin was simply easier. One drug worked on many bacteria. Phages did not work that way. The early Western trials were also, by modern standards, badly run, inconsistent preparations, no controls, results that could not be repeated. So the file was closed. Not marked failed. Just closed for 70 years, mostly in languages American physicians did not read. That is what Stephanie Strathy was reading at 3 a.m, 12 feet from a man on a ventilator. She printed what she could find and took it to the infectious disease specialist running her husband's case, Robert Schooley at UC San Diego, and put to him a request that in almost any other week would have ended the conversation. Could they put those into her husband? Here is what she was proposing to put into her husband. A bacteriophage does not look like anything else in biology. Under an electron microscope it looks manufactured. A geometric head, a straight shaft, and a set of thin legs at the bottom. It looks like a lunar lander and it behaves like one. It descends onto the surface of a bacterium, the legs make contact, they lock, and the shaft drives down through the cell wall like a syringe. Then it injects its instructions and does nothing else. The phage itself never enters. It never eats anything. What happens next is the second image, and it is the one that matters. A bacterium is a factory. It has machinery for reading blueprints and building proteins, and that machinery does not check whose blueprints it is reading. The phage's genetic material arrives, the factory picks it up, and the factory starts building phages. Hundreds of them out of the cell's own material, using the cell's own energy. Then the new phages make an enzyme that cuts the wall from the inside, and the bacterium bursts. Every one of those hundreds goes looking for another bacterium of the same kind. And that phrase, of the same kind, is the entire problem and the entire promise. An antibiotic is a blunt weapon. It does not know which bacteria in your body it is killing, which is why antibiotics wreck your gut along with the infection. A phage is the opposite. Those legs on the lander only lock onto one specific structure on one specific surface. A phage that destroys one strain of Acinetobacter may be completely useless against the strain in the next bed. Which means you cannot stock phage therapy on a shelf. For each patient, you have to go out into the world and find the predator that happens to fit. So that is what they did. Strathy sent Tom's own isolate, his personal strain grown from his own abdomen, to anyone who would take it. The Center for Phage Technology at Texas A&M University screened environmental samples against it. So did the Biological Defense Research Directorate of the U.S. Naval Medical Research Center, a laboratory that had been quietly collecting phages for years. They screened sewage, standing water, farm runoff. The places where bacteria are thickest are the places where the things that eat bacteria are thickest. And out of that search, both groups found phages that killed the organism that was killing Thomas Patterson. They purified them, because a raw phage preparation carries bacterial debris that would have driven a septic man straight into shock, and they built them into cocktails, several phages at once, so that a bacterium escaping one would run into another. On day 108, the team applied to the Food and Drug Administration for an emergency investigational new drug authorization. the mechanism that allows an unapproved treatment to be used on a dying patient who has run out of options. It was granted. On day 109, the first cocktail went in through the catheters already draining the cyst, straight into the cavity where the bacteria lived. 36 hours later, on day 111, they put a second cocktail directly into his bloodstream. Nobody in the United States had done that for this organism before. Thomas Patterson woke up. He had been unresponsive for weeks. He lifted his head and recognized his daughter. The rest was not a miracle, and the paper is careful about this. 4 days later, once the organism tested susceptible to it, they added the antibiotic minocycline alongside the phages. Around day 221, the bacterium had evolved resistance to the phages it had been meeting, exactly as it had evolved resistance to every drug before them, and a third cocktail had to be built. On day 245, he went home. He went back to work. The case was published in 2017 in Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy by Robert Schooley and colleagues at the University of California, San Diego, the first documented use of intravenous bacteriophage therapy to treat a disseminated resistant Acinetobacter baumannii infection in the United States. What it changed began with the paperwork, which sounds like the dullest part of this and is not. The emergency authorization they used was never designed with phages in mind, and until that week nobody had walked a personalized phage cocktail through it. Every American phage case since has followed the path that was cut open for Thomas Patterson. Because that path existed, the same two people could build something standing on it. In June of 2018, Stephanie Strathy and Robert Schooley opened the Center for Innovative Phage Applications and Therapeutics at UC San Diego, the first phage therapy center in North America. It treats patients case by case under compassionate use, and it runs clinical trials. And then the science turned over on itself in a way nobody had planned for. Go back to day 221, when the bacterium inside Tom Patterson evolved resistance to the phages and a third cocktail had to be built. For years that was understood as phage therapy's fatal flaw. Bacteria escape phages the same way they escape drugs, so why bother? It is now understood as one of its best features. Because of where the lander has to touch down. The structures a phage grabs onto are often the same structures a bacterium uses to survive antibiotics. The pumps it uses to push drugs out of itself, the capsule it hides behind. A bacterium that changes those structures to escape the phage frequently gives up its drug resistance in the trade. Researchers can now aim a phage specifically to force that choice. Escape me and you become vulnerable to the drug again. It has a name. They call it phage steering. One honest limit, because this channel does not overstate. This is a single patient. Bacteriophage therapy is still not an approved treatment in the United States. It is used case by case, and the randomized trials that would settle its value are still running. For 4 months, everyone treating Thomas Patterson did what the standard of care allowed. They were not careless and they were not slow. They worked down the list of every drug that existed in order, and the list ended. The thing that saved him had been described in a journal in 1917, used on patients for decades, and left in a file the field had stopped reading. So here is the question this case leaves open. How many other answers are already published, correct, tested, sitting in a language or a country or a decade that the rest of medicine stopped paying attention to?